Nobody in Ashford County wanted the old ice house by Blackwater Lake. Not the bank, not the town council, not even the demolition crew that had been offered the stone for free. The roof sagged under 40 winters of snow, the iron door was chained shut, and every child in town knew the warning whispered by their parents. Stay away from that place after dark. So when 68-year-old Margaret Ellis bought it at a county auction for $11, the whole room laughed. Her daughter covered her face in shame. Her son told the clerk, loud enough for everyone to hear, that this was exactly why their mother could no longer make decisions for herself. Just 1 week earlier, they had sold the house Margaret had shared with her late husband for 36 years and signed papers to move her into a nursing facility she had never agreed to enter. They thought she was confused. They thought she was finished. They thought $11 was the last foolish act of an old widow with nowhere left to go. But Margaret had spent 39 years as an emergency room nurse. She knew the difference between something dead and something simply waiting to be saved. On her third night inside the ice house, with frost on her blanket and a lantern shaking in her hand, she thawed a strange section of the back wall. Behind the ice, metal shifted. What she pulled out was not treasure. It was a rusted tin box containing a baby's hospital bracelet, a letter in her husband's handwriting, and a truth her children had been standing on top of their entire lives. If you have ever seen someone older treated like their life was already over, stay with Margaret's story, because sometimes the person everyone tries to put away is the only one strong enough to uncover what a family buried. And before this ice house became a shelter, before the truth thawed, we need to understand who Margaret Ellis had been before her own children decided she was no longer worth listening to. Long before anyone in Ashford County laughed at Margaret Ellis, people used to step aside when she walked into an emergency room, not because she was loud. Margaret had never been loud. She had a calmness that made panic feel embarrassed of itself. In the county hospital, where farmers came in with crushed hands, children arrived blue-lipped from lake water, and old men pretended their chest pain was only indigestion, Margaret was the nurse who could read a room before a doctor had finished asking questions. She knew which child was hiding pain because his father looked scared. She knew when a patient needed medicine, and when they needed someone to hold their hand without making promises no human being had the right to make. For 39 years, she worked nights, holidays, blizzards, and heat waves. She missed school concerts. She missed birthdays she had baked the cake for herself, but she never missed a mortgage payment, never missed a lunch packed for Diane, never let Richard go to school in a coat too thin for winter. Thomas Ellis used to say Margaret could bring warmth into a room without touching the thermostat. He had met her during the winter of 1981, when a storm shut down half the county roads. Thomas was not a patient that night. He had come in carrying an elderly neighbor who had slipped on the ice outside the feed store. He was a broad-shouldered man then, with sawdust on his coat, a split knuckle wrapped in a handkerchief, and the quiet manners of someone raised to fix things before complaining about them. When Margaret finally sat down for the first time in 10 hours, Thomas placed a cup of vending machine coffee beside her and said, "You look like someone who keeps the whole world from freezing." She should have laughed. Instead, she married him 11 months later. They bought the small white house on Alder Street with peeling shutters, a stubborn furnace, and a maple tree in the yard. Thomas repaired the porch himself. Margaret painted the kitchen yellow because she said winter needed somewhere to stop at the door. They brought Diane home to that kitchen first. 3 years later, they brought Richard home, wrapped in a blue blanket so soft Margaret kept it folded in the cedar chest long after he outgrew it. Life was never easy, but it was full. Margaret learned to stretch one pot roast into 3 meals because the children needed braces, school shoes, and winter coats. On Sundays, the house smelled of onions, coffee, and lemon polish. Diane did homework at the kitchen table while Margaret quizzed her on spelling words between stirring gravy. Richard followed Thomas into the garage, asking what every tool did, then losing interest whenever the answer required patience. When the children were young, they ran to Margaret with every scraped knee, every fever, every nightmare. Diane used to ask if bad things always ended. Margaret would smooth her hair and say, "Not always. But we can decide what kind of people we are while they're happening." Richard was different. He hated being helpless. Even as a boy, he wanted answers fast, doors opened fast, problems solved before anyone saw him afraid. Margaret loved him for that sharpness, though it worried her too. Thomas once told her, while watching Richard throw a wrench after failing to loosen a bolt, "That boy thinks control and safety are the same thing." Margaret had not understood how true that would become. After Thomas died, the house on Alder Street changed slowly. Not all at once. That would have been easier to name. At first, Diane brought casseroles and stayed long enough to wash the dish. Richard came on Saturdays to check the gutters, though he spent most of the time on his phone. Then the visits shortened, the calls became practical. Had she taken her blood pressure pill? Had she paid the insurance? Why was the back step still loose? Margaret tried not to resent concern. Concern, in the right hands, was love wearing work clothes. But what her children brought into her house did not feel like concern. It felt like inspection. They began speaking over her at her own kitchen table. They used words like transition, safety, supervision, long-term planning. Diane opened cupboards without asking. Richard glanced through mail stacked beside the telephone. One afternoon, Margaret found Thomas's old toolbox missing from the basement shelf. Richard said he had taken it before it rusted into junk. That night, Margaret sat in the yellow kitchen Thomas had painted twice for her and noticed the house felt colder than any winter they had survived together. The furnace still worked. The windows were sealed, but the warmth had begun leaving through places no weather strip could reach. The decision had already been made before Margaret was invited to the table. Diane called it a family meeting, but Margaret knew better the moment she stepped into the kitchen. Folders sat beside her salt shaker. Richard's laptop was open. A glossy brochure lay in the center of the table, showing a brick building with flower boxes under the windows and a cheerful name printed in blue letters. Willow Creek Senior Living. Margaret did not sit down. "What is this?" she asked. Diane folded her hands as if she had rehearsed the gesture. "Mom, please don't get upset. We need to talk about what's best for you." Margaret had heard that phrase too many times in hospital rooms. What's best for you often meant what is easiest for everyone else. Richard turned his laptop toward her. Numbers filled the screen. "The Alder Street house is worth more than you think," he said. "If we wait too long, repairs will reduce the value." "My house is not a stock account," Margaret said. Diane exhaled. "Nobody said it was, but you had it valued." Richard's jaw tightened. "We had to understand the situation." Margaret looked at the brochure again. The smiling residence on the cover held coffee cups under perfect lighting. It looked clean, safe, and empty of anyone's real life. "I'm not moving there," she said. Diane's face softened in a way that made Margaret more afraid than anger would have. "Mom, you forgot the kettle last month. The back step is loose. You're alone in this house. The kettle was sitting on the stove because I had washed it. You told me you couldn't remember." "I told you I couldn't remember why my daughter was interrogating me over tea." Richard leaned back. "This is what we mean. You don't see the pattern. A pattern. One loose step, one kettle, a few old pills in the cabinet because her prescription had changed. Small human things, gathered like evidence." Margaret placed both hands on the back of a chair. "For 39 years, she said, families trusted me to keep people alive in the worst moments of their lives. Now my own children think I can't boil water." Diane looked away. Richard did not. "This isn't about your pride." "No," Margaret said. "It's about my consent." That word made the room colder. Richard closed the laptop. "We're trying to prevent a crisis. Then stop creating one." Diane reached for the brochure. "Willow Creek has nurses on staff. Meals, medication management, activities. You wouldn't have to worry about the house anymore." "I was a nurse," Margaret said. "I know what nurses on staff means. I also know the difference between care and containment." Diane's voice cracked. "Why are you making this so hard?" Margaret looked at her daughter for a long second, then at Richard. "Because it is my life." Neither of them answered. Then Richard opened the folder closest to him. "We've spoken with a realtor." Margaret felt the words before she understood them. "When?" "It was preliminary." "You brought a stranger through my home?" Diane said, "Mom, It was only to see what options we had. My home is not an option. Richard's patience finally thinned. The sale would help pay for your care. My care, Margaret said, or your convenience. Diane stood, chair scraping against the floor. That is cruel. No, Margaret said quietly. Cruel is planning a woman's future at her own kitchen table and calling her unreasonable for noticing. The argument might have ended there if Margaret had not seen the hallway. The cedar chest was open. Thomas's cedar chest. She walked toward it before either child could stop her. The top tray had been disturbed. The old blue blanket Richard had come home in was gone. So were several envelopes Thomas had tied with twine and marked in his careful handwriting. County records. Blackwater. Personal. Margaret turned around. Where are Thomas's papers? Richard followed her into the hall. I moved some things to keep them organized. They were in my chest. They were deteriorating. They were my husband's. Diane came up behind him. Mom, please. Don't turn this into something dramatic. Margaret faced them both. I have held pressure on a bleeding artery while calling for blood with my other hand, she said. I have cleaned the face of a dead man because his wife was coming to say goodbye. Do not stand in my hallway and tell me I'm being dramatic because I want to know where my husband's papers went. For the first time that day, Diane looked ashamed. Richard only looked cornered. Those Blackwater papers are nothing, he said too quickly. Old county junk. Dad kept everything. Blackwater. The word moved through Margaret like cold water under a door. Thomas had rarely spoken of Blackwater Lake. Years ago, on a winter drive, they had passed the old stone ice house near the shore. Thomas had slowed the truck and looked at it with an expression she had never forgotten. Some things survive because someone keeps them cold until the right time, he had said. When she asked what he meant, he smiled sadly and called it foolish poetry. But Thomas had never been careless with words. What papers, Richard? Margaret asked. His mouth tightened. Diane glanced at him. That small glance told Margaret more than either of them intended. They were not only worried about her safety, they were worried about what she might find if she remained inside her own house, with her own memories and her husband's private records. 2 days later, the realtor's sign appeared on the lawn. Margaret had not signed anything. Richard said the process could begin while paperwork was sorted out. Diane said it was only temporary, just to measure interest. A woman from Willow Creek called and said they were excited to welcome her. Welcome, as if Margaret had knocked. The next morning, Diane arrived with 2 suitcases. She folded Margaret's clothes with a bright, brittle voice, talking about meals, activities, and how much easier life would be after the transition. Richard waited in the driveway, taking calls beside his car. Margaret walked through the house slowly. The yellow kitchen, the porch Thomas had repaired, the pencil marks on the doorframe where Richard's height had climbed year after year, the stair where Diane once sat crying over a failed exam, while Margaret rubbed her back and promised one bad day did not decide a life. At the front door, Diane held out Margaret's winter coat. We're doing this because we love you, she said. Margaret looked at her daughter and saw that Diane needed to believe it. Richard opened the car door. Margaret stepped onto the porch. In her coat pocket, her fingers closed around the old house key. It could not save her, but it reminded her that a locked door was not the same thing as the end of a life. And somewhere in her memory, beside Thomas's voice and the word Blackwater, something cold and waiting began to call her name. Willow Creek smelled like lemon cleaner, boiled vegetables, and quiet surrender. Margaret noticed it before Diane finished parking the car. The building was not ugly. There were white rocking chairs on the porch, flower beds trimmed with brown winter mulch, and a brass plaque beside the front door polished so brightly it reflected the gray sky. Diane touched Margaret's arm. Just look around, Mom. Please. Richard was already at the reception desk, smiling at the administrator with the confidence of a man who believed forms existed to be handled by people like him. Margaret stood near the lobby window and watched an old woman in a pink sweater sleep in front of a television no one was watching. A nurse pushed a cart down the hall. Somewhere, a spoon tapped against a dish, again and again. She had worked in places like this. Some were kind, some were necessary, But even the kindest place could become a cage if a person was carried into it against her will. The administrator, Mrs. Bell, came forward with a practiced smile. "Margaret, we're so happy to welcome you." Margaret looked at the woman's name tag. "I haven't agreed to be welcomed." Diane's cheeks reddened. "Mom." Mrs. Bell's smile became more careful. "Of course. We want every resident to feel comfortable." "Resident," Margaret repeated. "That's a strong word for someone who hasn't signed anything." Richard stepped in. "We're still sorting out paperwork." Margaret turned to him. "No, you are sorting out paperwork. I am standing here." For the first time, Mrs. Bell looked directly at Margaret instead of through the children around her. "There are consent forms," Mrs. Bell said slowly. "Unless there's a guardianship order, we cannot admit anyone against their will." Diane stared at her brother. Richard's face tightened. "We're pursuing appropriate authority if needed." Margaret picked up the pen on the clipboard, held it for a moment, then set it back down without writing a letter of her name. "I spent 39 years telling frightened people what they were signing," she said. "No one taught me to sign away my own life, because my children were in a hurry." She walked out before either of them found words big enough to stop her. The cold hit her at the porch steps, sharp enough to clear her head. Behind her, Diane called her name. Richard's voice followed, lower and angrier. Margaret did not run. She walked with the steady pace she had used in emergency rooms, when alarms were screaming and everyone else moved too fast. At the sidewalk, she turned toward downtown. Ashford County was small enough that a woman with a winter coat, a purse, and nowhere to go could cross half of it before anyone decided whether to call the police. Margaret passed the pharmacy, the closed bakery, and the courthouse where Thomas had once paid a property tax bill with coins from a coffee can during a lean year. On the courthouse steps, a sheet of paper flapped beneath a glass notice board. "County surplus auction today. 11 a.m." Most listings meant nothing to her. Old road equipment, broken office furniture, 2 seized storage lots. Then her eyes stopped. Parcel 14B, former Blackwater ice storage house. Structure condemned. No utilities. Buyer assumes all risk. Starting bid, $10. Blackwater. The old ice house rose in her memory. Stone-walled and hunched beside the dark lake. The place Thomas had once stared at, as if it were not a ruin but a locked room inside himself. She had $11 in cash, 2 5s and a 1 folded behind her library card, money Diane had not thought to ask about because it was too small to respect. The auction was held in a courthouse basement room. By the time Margaret arrived, a dozen people sat in folding chairs, most of them contractors, scrap buyers, or men who came to county auctions because watching unwanted things change hands made them feel practical. A clerk with silver glasses looked up. "Can I help you, ma'am? I'm here to bid." A few heads turned. The clerk hesitated only a second. "Registration is at the table." Margaret wrote her name with a steady hand. In the back row, Samuel Pike sat with his elbows on his knees, wearing a brown canvas coat. He owned Pike Hardware, though Margaret remembered him better as the man who had once fixed the hospital's generator during an ice storm and refused payment until every patient had heat. His eyes narrowed when he saw her bidder card. "Margaret Ellis," he said quietly. "Does Richard know you're here?" "No," Margaret said. "That is part of the appeal." Samuel almost smiled, but something sad crossed his face. When the clerk called parcel 14B, the room changed. Not with interest, with amusement. The clerk cleared his throat. Former Blackwater ice storage house. Condemned structure. No functioning access road beyond county track. No confirmed water rights. No electrical connection. Interior unsafe. Town recommends demolition or abandonment. Starting bid $10. No one lifted a hand. A contractor in the front row laughed. "You'd have to pay me to take it." The clerk looked ready to pass the parcel. Margaret raised her bidder card. Silence fell. Then laughter moved through the room. $10, the clerk said, surprised. Margaret opened her purse, touched the folded bills, and remembered Diane holding out the winter coat as if she were dressing a child. She remembered Richard turning her home into numbers on a screen. She remembered Thomas saying some things survived because someone kept them cold. The clerk glanced around. Any other bids? The contractor turned in his chair. Lady, that place will kill you before spring. Margaret met his eyes. Then I'll have until spring to prove you wrong. Someone laughed louder. Samuel did not. Going once, the clerk said. Going twice. Richard burst into the room just as the gavel came down. Sold. Parcel 14B to Margaret Ellis for $10. Diane was behind him, breathless, face pale with embarrassment. Mom, she whispered, what have you done? Margaret placed her last dollar on the table for the recording fee. The clerk looked at it, then at her, and stamped the paper. Richard walked toward her. This is insane. You can't buy a condemned building. You don't even know what you're doing. Margaret folded the receipt and slipped it into her coat pocket, beside the Alder Street key. No, she said. For the first time in days, I know exactly what I'm doing. Outside, snow began to move through the air in small, hard flakes. Beyond town, past the road and the bare trees, Blackwater Lake waited under its sheet of winter gray, and beside it stood the ice house nobody wanted, a place too cold for comfort, too useless for profit, too forgotten for anyone to guard. Margaret looked toward the lake and felt, not peace exactly, but direction. Thomas had left something in the cold. And now, because everyone had been too busy taking her warm house away, Margaret was finally going to find it. The road to Blackwater Lake was not really a road anymore. It was a county track, half swallowed by weeds, frozen mud, and snow that had fallen before Christmas and never fully melted. Margaret walked the last quarter mile because Richard had refused to drive her there, and Diane had cried all the way back to her car, saying their mother was humiliating the family in public. Samuel Pike was the one who brought Margaret from town in his old pickup. He did not ask too many questions. That was one reason Margaret trusted him. The ice house appeared between bare trees, like something the winter had built and then abandoned. It was made of dark stone, low and wide, with a roof that sagged in the middle and iron hinges rusted nearly black. Blackwater Lake lay behind it, flat and silent beneath a skin of gray ice. Samuel shut off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. You don't have to stay here tonight, he said. Margaret looked at the building she had bought for $10 and recorded with one more. I know. There's a spare room over the hardware store. I know that too. Samuel rubbed his thumb along the steering wheel. Thomas came out here sometimes. Margaret turned her head. Samuel looked through the windshield instead of at her. Not often, but enough that I remember. Why? I was hoping you might tell me someday. That was all he said. He helped her carry in what little she had. One suitcase, a canvas grocery bag, her old medical bag, a lantern, 2 blankets, and a thermos of coffee Samuel had filled without asking. At the door, the chain resisted until Samuel cut it with bolt cutters. The sound snapped through the cold like a bone breaking. The door opened inward with a groan. The air inside was colder than the air outside. Margaret felt it enter her sleeves, her collar, the spaces between her fingers. The room smelled of stone, old water, rust, and something mineral, like pennies held under the tongue. Her breath appeared white in front of her face. Samuel lifted the lantern. The ice house was mostly one open chamber. Thick stone walls, a cracked concrete floor, wooden beams dark with age. Metal hooks hung from the ceiling where blocks of ice had once been lifted and stored. In one corner sat the remains of a workbench. In another, a pile of broken crates had collapsed into themselves. Roof leaks on the east side, Samuel said. Back wall sweats even in summer. Floor dips near the drain. Don't step there after dark. Margaret listened carefully. A nurse learned early that fear became smaller when turned into a checklist. Roof, wall, floor, drain, door. Problems were less powerful when named. She set her medical bag on the workbench and opened it. Bandages, antiseptic, aspirin, a flashlight, scissors, gloves, a roll of tape, and a thermometer. Diane had once told her it was strange that she still carried it in the car. Margaret had said emergencies did not schedule themselves for youth. Samuel watched her pull on gloves. You planning to treat the building? He asked. If it bleeds, I'll consider it. That earned a quiet laugh from him. Together, They cleared a corner near the front wall where the floor seemed driest. Samuel nailed 2 boards across a broken window gap and left a small vent near the top. Margaret checked the stovepipe of an old iron heater and refused to light it until Samuel confirmed it was clear enough not to poison her in her sleep. "You always this cautious?" he asked. "I've seen what happens when people aren't." By dusk, they had made something that was not comfort but was no longer pure danger. A cot Samuel found in his truck, 2 blankets, the lantern, a crate turned upside down for a table, the thermos of coffee, a small fire inside the iron stove, watched carefully, coaxed low and steady. Warmth did not fill the ice house. It gathered in one corner like a shy animal. Samuel stood near the door, hat in hand. "I can come back in the morning." Margaret nodded. "Thank you." He looked as if there was more he wanted to say. Instead, he reached into his coat and took out a small envelope. "Thomas gave me $20 once," Samuel said. "Years ago. Told me if you ever came asking for help around Blackwater, I should use it for supplies and keep my mouth shut until you asked the right question." Margaret did not move. Samuel placed the envelope on the crate. "I spent 10 on boards," he said. "I'll bring the rest in nails." "Samuel," he paused. "What was the right question?" His face tightened with regret. "I don't know," he said. That was Thomas's way. He trusted people to arrive when they were ready. After he left, the silence grew larger. Margaret sat on the cot in her coat and listened to the icehouse breathe. Wind moved along the roof. The stove ticked. Somewhere inside the wall, water clicked into a crack and froze again. Her hands ached from cold and work. A thin cut on her knuckle had reopened, and she cleaned it by lantern light with the same discipline she had once used at 3 in the morning after a 12-car pileup. Pain was information. Cold was information. Fear was information too. But it was not an order. She drank coffee from the thermos and let herself miss Thomas so sharply that for a minute she could not swallow. "What did you leave here?" she whispered. The icehouse gave no answer. Near midnight, Margaret woke to a sound she could not place. Not wind, not the stove. A faint metallic tick came from the back of the room. She sat up slowly. Her breath smoked in front of her. The lantern had burned low, but enough light remained to make the ice along the rear wall shine dull silver. Margaret took the flashlight from her medical bag and crossed the floor carefully, remembering Samuel's warning about the drain. The back wall was colder than the rest of the building. She felt it before touching it. The air changed 3 feet away, sharpening against her cheeks. Frost webbed the stone in thick white veins. At the center was a rectangular patch of ice smoother than the rest, as if someone had once covered something there and winter had learned the shape. Margaret raised the flashlight. There, near the lower right corner, scratched into the stone almost below eye level, was a small mark. A plain capital T, not carved deeply, not decorative. Just 2 lines crossing with the practical pressure of a man who never wasted motion. "Thomas." Margaret reached out, then stopped herself. She would not claw blindly at a frozen wall in the dark like a frightened animal. That was how people destroyed what they needed to understand. She went back to her medical bag, took out a roll of tape, and marked the floor 3 feet from the wall. Then she found an old crate, dragged it near the patch, and placed the lantern on top. She studied the ice the way she had once studied a patient's face before a diagnosis became obvious. The rectangular patch was not natural. The frost was too even at the edges. Behind it, something had been sealed. Margaret thought of Richard's expression when she asked about the Blackwater papers. She thought of Diane saying memories were not a plan. She thought of Thomas driving past this building years ago, his voice low, his hand warm on her knee. Some things survive because someone keeps them cold until the right time. The stove clicked behind her. From inside the wall came another soft metallic sound. This time, Margaret did not flinch. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, sat on the crate, and kept the flashlight pointed at the mark until dawn began turning the cracks in the door pale blue. For the first time since her children had carried suitcases down her front steps, Margaret did not feel homeless. She felt assigned. Margaret did not break the wall open. That was the first rule she gave herself. Fear wanted a hammer. Training wanted patience. After 39 years in emergency rooms, Margaret knew that if something mattered, you did not ruin it just because your hands were shaking. You observed first. You documented. You protected what might become evidence. At dawn, she made weak coffee on the little stove and stood before the rear wall. In daylight, the rectangular patch of ice looked even less natural. Frost covered the rest of the stone in uneven veins, but this section was smooth around the edges, like winter had frozen over a door. Near the lower corner, the small capital T waited. Thomas's mark. Margaret wrote the date and time in a notebook. Then she gathered what she had. A kettle, 2 towels, a shallow pan, Samuel's screwdriver, her gloves, and the careful part of herself her children had mistaken for weakness. She warmed water, soaked a towel, and pressed it against the lower edge of the ice. Steam rose. The ice cracked once, softly. Margaret stopped and listened. Nothing fell. Nothing shifted except a faint metallic tick somewhere behind the wall. She worked slowly after that. Warm towel, wait, wipe, look, repeat. By mid-morning, her back ached and her fingers had gone stiff inside her gloves, but the first layer of ice gave way. Behind it was not stone. It was wood. Old boards, dark with damp, fitted into the wall so neatly that anyone glancing over them would have seen only shadow. Margaret ran her fingers along the edge and found a seam, a hidden panel. Her pulse quickened, but her hands stayed steady. She eased the screwdriver into the seam and lifted a little at a time. The wood resisted, then loosened with a wet groan. Cold dust breathed out. Behind the panel was a narrow cavity. Inside sat a rusted tin box wrapped in oilcloth. For a moment, Margaret only stared. The box was small enough to hold in 2 hands. Somehow, that made it more frightening. Large secrets should have looked large. This one looked like something a person could hide under a coat and carry through a snowstorm. She brought it to the crate beside the lantern. The clasp was stiff, but not locked. Her thumb rested on it. She had faced blood, death, screaming relatives, and men twice her size begging not to be left alone. But this was different. This box had waited for her. Thomas had marked the wall. Samuel had been told to help. Richard had tried to take the Blackwater papers before she could read them. Margaret opened the box. On top lay a baby's hospital bracelet, yellowed with age. The writing was faded, but readable. Baby boy Wade, born the 14th of January 1982, Ashford County Hospital. Margaret's breath caught. Richard's birthday was in January 1982. Not that exact date, not the date in the family Bible, not the date on every school form, tax form, license, and birthday cake, but close enough to make the room tilt. Beneath the bracelet was a photograph. Thomas stood outside the Icehouse in a heavy coat, younger and broad-shouldered, his face grave. Beside him was a young woman with dark hair tucked under a wool hat. She held a bundle against her chest. Her eyes looked straight into the camera with the exhausted terror Margaret had seen in mothers who were trying not to collapse before their children were safe. On the back, in Thomas's handwriting, were 3 words: Clara and Son. Margaret sat on the cot before her knees could fail. Clara Wade. She searched her memory and found only fragments. A name whispered once in a hospital corridor. A young woman who had worked temporary shifts in records. A winter storm when too many things had happened at once. A night, Thomas came home late with snow in his hair and would not explain why he looked as if he had aged 10 years. Then she unfolded the letter. The first line nearly broke her. Maggie, if you are reading this, then the cold kept its promise. Margaret pressed the page flat with both hands. Thomas wrote that during the winter storm of 1982, Clara Wade had come to him near Blackwater Lake, bleeding, terrified, and carrying a newborn. She had seen something at Ashford County Hospital that powerful people wanted buried. She believed her child would not be safe if he remained tied to her name. Thomas did not write everything. The letter was careful, almost painfully careful. It said he had hidden Clara and the baby first at the Icehouse, then brought the child to someone he trusted at the hospital. It said the adoption papers were handled quickly, legally on the surface, but not cleanly underneath. Margaret's fingers tightened on the page. Richard, dear Richard. The baby she had brought home, wrapped in a blue blanket, after Thomas told her a young mother could not keep him. Margaret had been grieving a lost pregnancy then. She had wanted to love more than she had wanted to question. Thomas had said the mother wanted no contact. He had said the child needed a home. Margaret had believed him because she trusted him, and because the moment Richard's small hand closed around her finger, doubt felt cruel. Under the letter was a copied hospital intake sheet, damaged by water but still partly readable. Clara Wade. Emergency admission. The 14th of January, 1982. Near the bottom was another name, not as patient, not as doctor, but under administrative authorization. Harlan Foss. Margaret knew that name. Everyone in Ashford County knew it. Harlan Voss had become county commissioner, hospital board chairman, donor, benefactor, portrait on the wall kind of man. The kind of man people thanked in public and feared in private. Now his name sat on a stained paper, hidden behind ice. Margaret understood then why the Blackwater papers mattered. Not because they were old county junk, because they connected Richard, Thomas, Clara Wade, and Harlan Voss to a night somebody had worked hard to erase. The last item in the box was a smaller envelope. Thomas had written one sentence across it, for Margaret, when she has more help than fear. She almost opened it, then she stopped. Thomas had known her. He had known grief would make her try to carry the truth alone. He had known she might protect Richard even after he hurt her. He had known she would need witnesses, not just courage. Margaret placed everything on the crate in careful order. Bracelet, photograph, letter, intake sheet, sealed envelope. She used her old phone to take pictures of each item, then wrapped them again to keep them dry. By late afternoon, Samuel knocked at the doorframe with firewood under one arm. He stopped when he saw the open wall. Then he saw the box. His face changed. "What did you find?" he asked. Margaret picked up the photograph and turned it toward him. Samuel's mouth tightened. For the first time since she had known him, the hardware store owner looked less like a man with answers and more like someone who had spent years hoping never to be asked. Margaret held the picture steady. "Samuel," she said, "who was Clara Wade?" The fire clicked behind her. Samuel removed his hat, and the cold in the ice house suddenly felt older than winter. Samuel Pike did not answer at first. He set the firewood beside the stove, as if sudden movement might wake something sleeping in the walls. His eyes stayed on the photograph in Margaret's hand. "You knew Clara Wade," Margaret said. Samuel took off his gloves. "Everybody knew of her. Not everybody knew her. That is not an answer." "No," he said. "It's a coward's beginning." He sat on an overturned crate. Clara worked county records before she took temporary shifts at the hospital. Smart girl. Quiet. The kind of quiet people mistake for empty until they learn she has been listening the whole time. "And her son?" Samuel looked at the floor. "People said the baby died." The words struck the air between them. "I never saw a body," he added. "Never saw a grave. Just heard talk that Clara left town after the storm. Then later, no one said her name at all." Margaret folded the photograph back into the oilcloth. She wanted to ask more, but Samuel's face told her he had reached the edge of what he knew, or what he could bear to say without proof. Outside, tires crunched over frozen mud. Both of them turned. A faded blue sedan had stopped near the Icehouse, crooked on the track. Its engine coughed once and died. A young woman sat behind the wheel, with both hands gripping it. In the back seat, a child coughed hard enough that Margaret felt it in her own chest. The nurse in her moved before the wounded mother did. Margaret opened the door. Cold rushed in. "Are you all right?" The woman flinched, then lowered the window 2 inches. She could not have been more than 30. Her coat was too thin. Fear had made her face older than her body. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know anyone was here. We just needed to pull over. My son's coughing, and the car heater stopped." Margaret looked past her. A little boy, maybe 4, sat under a dinosaur blanket. His cheeks were flushed, but his lips were not blue. "Not yet. What's his name?" "Noah." "And yours?" "Lila." Lila Brooks. Margaret did not ask why Lila was out by Blackwater Lake with a sick child and a car full of plastic bags. Some answers announced themselves. Bring him inside, Margaret said. Lila shook her head. We don't want trouble. Cold is trouble. Come in before it wins. Samuel opened the back door, while Margaret cleared space near the stove. Lila carried Noah in, wrapped tightly in the blanket. The child blinked at Margaret with glassy eyes. The ice house, for the first time, held someone else's fear. Margaret knelt before him. Hi, Noah. I'm Margaret. I used to help people feel better for a living. He coughed. Can I listen? Lila stiffened until Margaret held up the stethoscope from her medical bag. I'm not guessing, Margaret said. I'm checking. Lila nodded. Margaret warmed the metal chest piece in her palm before placing it under Noah's shirt. She listened to his lungs, counted his breaths, checked his temperature, and looked at the color under his fingernails. Fever, exhaustion, a hard cough, but not the emergency it could become if the night got colder. He needs warmth, fluids, and rest, Margaret said. If his breathing worsens, we go to the hospital. Lila swallowed. I don't have money for that. We'll solve one danger at a time. Samuel brought in more wood. Margaret heated soup from a can, thinning it with water and stirring slowly. Lila sat close to the stove with Noah on her lap, her eyes moving around the cracked walls, the cot, the crates, the lantern, and the old hooks in the beams. This place looks like it should be haunted, Lila whispered. It may be, Margaret said. But so far, the ghosts have better manners than my children. A startled laugh escaped Lila. That laugh changed the room. Not enough to make the ice house safe or beautiful, but something loosened. Samuel found another crate for Lila. Margaret gave Noah the better blanket. The stove worked harder. Steam rose from soup cups. The walls remained frozen, yet the corner near the fire began to feel less like survival and more like shelter. Later, after Noah fell asleep on the cot, Lila helped Margaret wash the cups with melted snow warmed in a pan. You don't have to tell me, Margaret said. But are you running from someone? Lila's hand stopped in the water. Not running, she said. More like out of places to be. Landlord sold the duplex. My hours got cut. My mother says she's done rescuing me. My ex says Noah isn't his problem unless a court makes him remember. Margaret dried a cup. People love the word problem when they're tired of saying person. Lila looked at her then. I used to work part-time at County Records, she said. Before Noah got sick too often and I lost the job. County Records. The tin box seemed to grow heavier beneath the blanket. Margaret did not show Lila everything. Not yet, but she took out the photograph of Clara Wade and held it under the lantern. Do you know this woman? Lila leaned close. Then her face drained of color. Where did you get that? You know her. I know the name. Lila glanced toward the door, as if old records could send men through it. Clara Wade. There was an index card in the restricted drawer. Not a full file, just a cross-reference. To what? I only saw it once. A supervisor took it from me. But I remember the label because it was strange. What did it say? Lila's voice dropped. Winter Refuge Covenant. Blackwater Icehouse. Samuel, standing by the stove, closed his eyes. Margaret felt the room tilt again. But this time, she did not feel alone inside it. The Icehouse had not only hidden a family secret, it had been tied to a promise. A legal promise. Maybe. A moral one. Certainly. Something Clara Wade had left behind, or tried to leave behind, before her name was pushed into silence. Noah coughed in his sleep. Margaret crossed to him and adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. Lila watched her with the exhausted disbelief of someone who had expected another closed door and found a hand on the latch instead. You can stay tonight, Margaret said. We don't want to take your space. Margaret looked around the ruined building, the frozen wall, the stove, the cot, Samuel with his firewood, the child asleep under the good blanket, and the hidden box that had waited decades to be opened. For days, her own children had spoken as if her life needed to become smaller. Now, in the coldest building in Ashford County, her life had made room. You're not taking it, Margaret said. You're helping me find out what this place was always supposed to be. Outside, snow began to fall again over Blackwater Lake. Inside, the ice house held its first real night of warmth. By morning, The ice house no longer felt like a place Margaret had bought. It felt like a place that had begun asking things of her. Noah's fever broke just after sunrise. Lila cried quietly when she touched his forehead and found his skin warm but no longer burning. She tried to apologize for the tears, as if gratitude were something messy that needed to be hidden. Margaret handed her a clean towel. Mothers are allowed to leak when the danger passes. That made Lila laugh into the towel. Samuel arrived with nails, a second cot, and 2 bags of groceries he claimed had been sitting around the hardware store. Though Margaret was fairly sure canned peaches and children's cough syrup were not standard hardware inventory. By noon, the front corner of the ice house had changed again. There was a place for wood, a place for blankets, a crate for canned food, and a sheet of cardboard where Margaret wrote simple rules in black marker. Keep the stove clear, dry socks by the line, sick children first. No one opens the back wall without Margaret. Lila read the last rule and raised an eyebrow. Margaret did not explain. The first stranger came that evening. He was an old man named Earl Dunn, a retired school bus driver who had been sleeping in his truck after his nephew sold the house they had shared. Samuel found him outside Pike Hardware, coughing into his sleeve, and sent him toward Blackwater with a bundle of firewood and the warning that Margaret Ellis would not tolerate foolishness. Earl arrived embarrassed, carrying a paper sack, and the pride of a man who would rather freeze than beg. "I'm not here for charity," he said before Margaret could greet him. "Good," Margaret said. "Then you can stack wood." He blinked. She pointed to the pile by the door. "After that, you can drink soup." Earl stayed. The next day, a retired teacher brought 2 boxes of books after hearing Lila's son was bored. A woman from the church left coats without giving her name. Someone set a bag of potatoes outside the door and drove away before Margaret could see who it was. The town did not know what to call the ice house yet. Some still called it crazy. Some called it dangerous. But a few began calling it Margaret's place. That was when Diane called. Margaret let the phone ring twice before answering. "Mom, where are you sleeping?" Diane asked. "In the building I own." "That's not an answer. It is the legal one." There was a pause. Margaret could hear traffic in the background. Then Diane lowering her voice. "People are talking. People have been talking since before I was born. They say you have strangers there." "I have guests." "In a condemned ice house? In a cold county?" Diane exhaled sharply. "You're making this impossible." Margaret looked across the room. Noah was coloring on the cardboard box that held canned soup. Earl was repairing a loose hinge. Lila was folding blankets. Samuel was measuring a window frame. "No," Margaret said. "For the first time in a while, I'm making something possible." She hung up before Diane could turn worry into command. That afternoon, Lila convinced Margaret to visit Evelyn Cho. Evelyn lived above the old pharmacy in an apartment full of legal books, houseplants, and teacups that did not match. She was 76, retired from law after a stroke stiffened 2 fingers on her right hand, and known in Ashford County as the woman who could remember deeds better than most people remembered birthdays. Margaret placed the copied intake sheet, Thomas's letter, the photograph, and the phrase Lila remembered on Evelyn's dining table. Winter Refuge Covenant. Evelyn did not touch the papers at first. She put on her glasses, leaned over them, and went very still. "Where did you hear this phrase?" "Lila saw it on an index card at County Records," Margaret said. "Connected to Clara Wade and the Blackwater Ice House." Evelyn looked at Lila. "Restricted drawer?" Lila nodded. Evelyn muttered something unkind about county clerks who confused secrecy with importance. Then she stood, crossed to a narrow cabinet, and pulled out an old green binder. "I kept notes from cases that bothered me," she said. "Not files. Notes. A lawyer retires, but her conscience rarely does." She turned pages slowly. Margaret watched her good hand move with precision, the stiff fingers bracing the binder. At last, Evelyn stopped. "There," she said. The page was dated 1984. Evelyn read aloud in pieces. "Blackwater Ice Storage House. Clara Wade. Conditional use. Emergency winter refuge. Protection from private redevelopment if maintained for public shelter during severe weather." Samuel's face hardened. So the ice house was never just junk. No, Evelyn said. It may have been neglected, but not legally meaningless. Margaret felt something inside her steady. Evelyn continued. If this covenant was properly recorded, the town cannot simply demolish the structure or sell it for redevelopment without addressing its protected purpose. But if the records were buried, misfiled, or intentionally restricted, someone wanted the place forgotten. Harlan Voss, Margaret said. Evelyn looked at the hospital sheet. That name has opened many doors in this county. It may also have closed more than a few. Lila shifted in her chair. Can this help Margaret keep the Icehouse? Maybe, Evelyn said, but only if we prove two things. First, that the covenant exists in official records. Second, that Margaret is restoring the property toward its protected use, not merely occupying a condemned building. Margaret almost laughed. Back at the Icehouse, Earl was stacking wood. Noah was sleeping under donated blankets, and soup was warming on a stove that had nearly gone cold forever. For once, her life had accidentally done the legally useful thing. How do we prove that? She asked. Evelyn picked up a pen. Names, dates, photographs, receipts, witnesses, every blanket donated, every repair made, every person sheltered. You were a nurse, Mrs. Ellis. Chart the building like a patient. Margaret understood that language. A patient did not heal because someone wished it. A patient healed because care was recorded, repeated, adjusted, and defended. When Margaret returned to the Icehouse that evening, she brought back a notebook with a black cover. On the first page, she wrote, Blackwater Winter Refuge Log. Then she listed the names, Lila Brooks, Noah Brooks, Earl Dunn, Samuel Pike, volunteer repairs, 2 coats donated, 6 cans of soup, 1 window braced, 1 child treated for fever and cough, 1 stove operating safely. She paused, then added one more line, purpose restored. Outside, 2 headlights slowed on the county track, then continued toward town. People were watching now. Margaret closed the notebook and looked at the room around her. The stove, the books, the blankets, the repaired window. The people who had nowhere else to be and were trying very hard not to look grateful. The Icehouse had not become beautiful. Not yet, but it had become harder to dismiss. And somewhere behind the sealed envelope Thomas had left, another truth waited for the moment when fear was finally outnumbered by help. The inspector arrived on a Thursday morning with a clipboard, polished boots, and the expression of a man who had already decided what the building was before he stepped inside. Richard came with him. That told Margaret more than the clipboard did. Diane followed behind, wrapped in a wool coat, too clean for the muddy county track. Her eyes moved over the stacked firewood, the patched window, the line of drying socks, and the smoke rising from the stovepipe. She looked relieved that Margaret was alive, then immediately embarrassed by what alive looked like here. The inspector introduced himself as Mr. Halpern from County Safety Compliance. Margaret wiped her hands on a towel. Come in before the heat leaves. Richard stepped through first, as if ownership could be performed by walking ahead. Lila stood near the cot with Noah behind her. Earl set down the hammer he had been using on a shelf. Samuel crossed his arms beside the stove. No one spoke, but the room changed. It became less like a shelter and more like a place being judged. Mr. Halpern looked up at the beams. Mrs. Ellis, we've received reports that people are occupying a condemned structure. People are warming themselves in a building I own, Margaret said. A condemned building. A recovering one. Richard gave a short laugh. This is exactly the problem. She thinks wordplay makes this safe. Margaret did not look at him. Mr. Halpern, would you like to see the repairs already completed? I would like to see permits. Samuel muttered. Of course you would. The inspector's eyes moved to him. And you are? A man who knows the difference between dangerous and inconvenient. Richard stepped farther into the room. This isn't a debate. Mom, you have a child sleeping here. A stranger. An elderly man. You're exposing everyone to liability and injury. Lila's face hardened. My son was coughing in a freezing car when she opened the door. And that is generous, Richard said, turning his practiced sympathy toward her. But generosity does not excuse reckless behavior. Margaret finally looked at her son. There were many ways to wound someone. Richard's favorite was making cruelty sound reasonable. Diane moved closer. "Mom, please. We're not here to fight. We're worried. People in town are saying you've started some kind of shelter. People in town are leaving coats at the door," Margaret said. "That says something too." Mr. Halpern walked slowly through the ice house, tapping one beam with the end of his pen, photographing the stove, the boarded window, the repaired latch, the rear wall. When he reached the marked-off area near the hidden panel, Margaret stepped between him and the crate. "That section is not open for inspection without my attorney present." Richard's head turned sharply. "Your attorney?" "Evelyn Cho is advising me." Diane looked genuinely startled. "Mom, why would you need a lawyer?" Margaret held her daughter's eyes. "Because my children taught me the danger of trusting family with paperwork." For once, Diane had no reply. Mr. Halpern cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ellis, there are serious concerns. Fire safety, structural stability, sanitation, unauthorized residential use." Margaret nodded. "Write them down." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "Write them down clearly. I'll address them one by one." Richard's patience broke through his polished surface. "You are not addressing anything. You are coming with us today." "No, you are making yourself look unstable." "No, Richard. I am making myself inconvenient." His face changed. "Not much, but enough." He lowered his voice. "Do you understand what this property is worth if the lakefront redevelopment goes through?" The room became very still. Diane whispered, "Richard." Margaret felt the sentence settle like ash. There it was. Not safety, not concern, not love wearing work clothes. Value, redevelopment. The ice house had become important only after she refused to be removed from it. Mr. Halpern looked up from his clipboard. "Lakefront redevelopment?" Richard recovered too quickly. "I'm speaking generally. This area has potential, but not if it becomes a squatter site." Earl took one step forward. "Careful who you call squatter." Margaret lifted a hand, and Earl stopped. She walked to the crate and picked up the black notebook. "This is the Blackwater Winter Refuge log. Names, dates, repairs, donations, medical concerns, firewood use, stove checks. We have photographs of work completed and a written plan for additional safety improvements." The inspector accepted the notebook. Against his will, his face shifted from dismissal to attention. "You kept records?" "I was an emergency room nurse for 39 years. If it matters, it gets charted." Samuel smiled faintly. Richard saw the smile and hated it. Then his gaze dropped to the crate beside the notebook. Margaret had covered the tin box with folded cloth, but a corner of the photograph had slipped out when she lifted the log. Just a corner. Thomas's coat sleeve, Clara Wade's hand, the edge of a bundled infant. Richard stared at it. The color left his face so quickly Diane noticed. "What is that?" he asked. Margaret covered it with her palm. "Something your father left for me." "My father?" The words came out sharper than he intended. Margaret heard them. Diane did too. Richard stepped forward. "Let me see it." "No." "Mom." "No," she said again. "You do not get to take every paper in my life and call it organization." His eyes flashed. "If this concerns the family, I have a right to know." Margaret's voice stayed low. "A right is not the same thing as permission." For a moment, the whole ice house seemed to lean toward that sentence. Mr. Halpern closed the notebook. "I can't approve occupancy today, but I'm also not ordering immediate evacuation if temporary safety corrections begin within 48 hours and no additional residents are admitted until review." Richard turned on him. "This place is condemned, and now documented," the inspector said. "There is a difference." Diane looked at Margaret with something more complicated than anger. Fear, maybe. Or the first bruise of understanding. Outside, tires sounded on the track. Another car had stopped near the door. A woman from town stepped out carrying a box of blankets, saw Richard and the inspector, and froze. Margaret opened the door wider. "Set them by the stove, please," she called. The woman obeyed. Richard watched the blankets come in. He watched Noah peek from behind Lila. He watched Earl pick up his hammer again, as if the interruption were already ending. This was what frightened him most, Margaret realized. Not the unsafe stove, not the old beams, not even the papers under her hand. What frightened Richard was that his mother had built something he could not control, and other people were beginning to believe in it. Before leaving, he leaned close enough that only Margaret could hear him. "You don't know what you're uncovering." Margaret looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not only greed in his face, but panic. "No," she said, "but you do." Richard walked out without answering. When the cars pulled away, the Icehouse remained tense for several breaths. Then Noah whispered, "Can I still color on the soup box?" Lila laughed first. Samuel next. Even Earl let out a rough sound that might have been relief. Margaret returned the photograph and tin box to their hiding place beneath the cloth. Her hand rested there a moment. The children she had raised had come to take control. Instead, they had revealed the next truth. The Icehouse was no longer only a refuge. It was a threat to everyone who needed the past to stay frozen. By the next morning, the storm had a name. The radio called it Winter System Helen, but in Ashford County, people simply watched the sky and understood. The clouds came low over Blackwater Lake. The wind sharpened. By noon, snow moved sideways across the county track, erasing tire marks almost as soon as they appeared. Mr. Halpern's 48 hours were not over. The county did not care. A notice arrived before the worst of the storm did, taped to the Icehouse door by a deputy who would not step inside. Temporary closure pending emergency safety review. Occupants must vacate by 6 p.m. Richard's name was not on the notice, but Margaret could feel his hand behind it. Lila read it twice. Noah pressed against her leg. "Where do we go?" she asked. Margaret looked at the snow beyond the open door. There were 6 people inside now. Lila and Noah, Earl, a widowed woman from the church whose furnace had failed, Samuel, who had stayed to brace the stovepipe, and Margaret, owner of a condemned icehouse that had become safer than the road outside. "We don't go into a blizzard because a paper is afraid of a building," Margaret said. At 4 o'clock, the first car slid off the county track. Samuel and Earl pulled the driver inside, a mail carrier named Ben with blood on his forehead and fingers too cold to bend. Margaret's old training took over. She sat him near the stove, checked his pupils, cleaned the cut, wrapped his hands, and told Lila to write the time in the refuge log. At 4:30, a second knock came, then a third. By 5, the Icehouse held 12 people. By 6, it held 19. The county road was blocked by snow. The church basement had lost heat. A power line had fallen near Alder Street. People who had laughed at Margaret's $11 building now stood inside it with wet coats, shaking hands, and the stunned humility of those who had discovered that dignity could come wrapped in borrowed blankets. Margaret moved through them like she had moved through emergency rooms. Not fast, not slow, but exact. Children near the inner wall. Wet socks off. Earl, keep a clear path to the door. Lila, names and symptoms. Samuel, watch the stove. Mrs. Bell, if you can count breaths, I need you here. Mrs. Bell, the administrator from Willow Creek, had been trapped on the road with 2 staff members. She obeyed without argument. At 7, Richard arrived with Diane and Mr. Halpern. The wind shoved them through the door. Richard's face was red from cold and anger. "This has gone far enough." Margaret turned from wrapping a child's foot in a dry towel. "Yes, the storm has." Mr. Halpern stared at the room. The logbook, the marked stove area, the clear walkway, the people alive because they had come in. Diane looked around, and something in her face weakened. Richard did not allow himself that mercy. "You were ordered to vacate, and 19 people were ordered by the weather to survive. This is exactly why you're dangerous," he snapped. "You think your judgment is above the county." Evelyn Cho's voice came from the doorway. "No, Mr. Ellis. The county is about to remember its own judgment." She stepped in with snow on her shoulders, carrying a waterproof document pouch. Behind her came a young county clerk, pale and nervous, holding a second folder. Richard went still. Evelyn set the pouch on a crate Margaret had cleared. "I found the covenant." The room quieted in uneven layers. Evelyn removed a copied deed, a court memorandum, and a recording certificate from 1984. Her stiff fingers moved carefully, but her voice did not tremble. The Blackwater Ice Storage House was placed under a conditional public refuge covenant by Clara Wade before her disappearance from county record. The structure could not be privately redeveloped, demolished for profit, or closed during severe winter emergency if it was being maintained for shelter use. Mr. Halpern swallowed. If that is recorded, it is, Evelyn said, misindexed, restricted without proper authority, and inconveniently buried. But recorded. Richard looked at the clerk. You had no right to release that. The clerk stepped back. Evelyn opened the second folder. This also connects to Ashford County Hospital records from January 1982. Clara Wade, temporary records employee. Emergency admission, newborn male. Administrative authorization signed by Harlan Voss. The older people in the room reacted first. Harlan Voss was a name that had sat over Ashford County for decades like a portrait no one dared take down. Richard's voice dropped. This is not the time. Margaret looked at him. It is exactly the time. Storms reveal which walls were built badly. Diane whispered. Richard, what is she talking about? Evelyn looked to Margaret, asking permission without words. Margaret took the rusted tin box from beneath the folded cloth. She did not hold it up like a weapon. She placed it on the crate, like evidence. Inside were the bracelet, the photograph, Thomas's letter, and the intake sheet. Diane reached for the photograph, then stopped herself. Who is that woman? Clara Wade, Margaret said. And her son. Richard stared at the baby's bracelet, as if it were a snake. Diane read the date. Her eyes moved to Richard. No, she said softly. Richard's face turned hard, but his eyes were frightened. You don't know what happened. Then tell us, Margaret said. For several seconds, only the wind spoke. Then Richard's anger cracked. I found a letter in Dad's toolbox after he died, he said. Not everything. Just enough. Blackwater, Clara. My name, Voss. He looked at Margaret, and for the first time he did not look like a man in control. He looked like the boy who had once thrown a wrench because a bolt would not move. I thought if those papers came out, I would become some scandal's leftover child. Margaret did not soften too quickly. So you tried to bury them again. I tried to protect the family. No, she said. You tried to protect the version of yourself that felt safest. His face twisted. You don't understand what it is to find out your whole life started with a lie. Margaret stepped closer. I understand holding a baby whose story was incomplete and loving him anyway. Richard flinched. Diane began to cry silently, not loudly enough to claim the room. Evelyn opened Thomas's final sealed envelope. Margaret had waited until she had more help than fear, and now the Icehouse was full of witnesses. The letter was short. Thomas wrote that Clara Wade had not abandoned her child. She had begged him to keep the baby alive after discovering that Harlan Voss and hospital officials were falsifying records for money and influence. She signed the refuge covenant to protect the Icehouse because it was the only place that had hidden her when no one else would. Then she disappeared before she could testify. At the bottom, Thomas had written one final line, Maggie, tell our son he was never unwanted. He was hidden because he was loved. Richard covered his mouth. No speech could have undone what he had done to Margaret. No sob could return the house, the papers, the trust. But the sentence struck him where pride had been standing. Mr. Halpern removed the closure notice from the door himself. This building remains under emergency use review, he said, voice rough, but no one is being forced into the storm tonight. Outside, the blizzard battered the stones. Inside, the old Icehouse held. Margaret looked at the people gathered under its patched roof. Frightened, cold, imperfect, alive. Then she looked at Richard. You may stay until the road clears, she said, but you do not get to take charge. He nodded once, broken enough to obey, and as the stove burned red in the center of the room, the truth that had been frozen for 40 years finally began to warm the living. By morning, the storm had buried every road to Blackwater Lake. The Icehouse stood under a thick white silence, its roof bowed but unbroken, its stone walls glazed with frost. Inside, people woke slowly under borrowed blankets. Someone stirred the stove. Someone whispered a prayer. Noah sat up on the cot, hair sticking in every direction, and asked if there were still peaches. There were. Margaret opened the can herself and gave him the first spoonful. No one spoke much about the night before. Not at first. Truth, like a wound, sometimes needed pressure before it needed air. Mr. Halpern returned 2 days later, after the plows cleared the county track. This time, he came without Richard. He wore work boots instead of polished ones and carried a folder thinner than the first. "The county is not lifting all safety concerns," he said. Margaret nodded. "I didn't expect miracles, but the emergency closure has been withdrawn pending restoration review. The covenant has to be examined formally. Until then, limited winter refuge use can continue under conditions." Samuel, standing behind her, made a sound that might have been victory, pretending to be a cough. Mr. Halpern handed Margaret a list. Stove shielding, exit clearance, structural assessment, sanitation plan, occupancy limits. Margaret read every line. "These are reasonable," she said. The inspector looked almost embarrassed. "You already started most of them." "I charted the patient," Margaret said. "Now we treat." Word spread faster than snowmelt. By the end of the week, Ashford County knew that the old Blackwater Icehouse was not merely a condemned ruin. It was tied to Clara Wade, to a buried refuge covenant, to hospital records people had once hidden beneath official silence. Harlan Voss's portrait disappeared from the hospital lobby for cleaning and did not return. Reporters called. Evelyn Cho answered only what needed answering and refused the rest. "This is not a circus," she told one of them. "It is a door that should have been left open 40 years ago." Diane came to the Icehouse on a Sunday afternoon. She came alone. No perfect coat, no legal pad, no practiced expression of patience. She carried Thomas's toolbox in both hands. The metal case was scratched, heavier than she expected, and Margaret saw from the way Diane held it that shame had weight. "I found it in Richard's garage," Diane said. "I should have asked before anything was taken." Margaret did not rush to comfort her. Diane set the toolbox on the repaired workbench. "I canceled the Willow Creek paperwork. I also called the realtor. The listing is withdrawn. I signed a statement for Evelyn saying you never consented." "That was necessary," Margaret said. "I know." Diane's mouth trembled, but she did not cry loudly. That mattered. She was not asking tears to do the work. "I thought I was being practical," she said. "Then I saw you in the storm. I saw all those people listening to you, and I realized I had confused being afraid for you with being allowed to decide for you." Margaret looked toward the stove, where Lila was teaching Noah how to fold towels. "Fear does that," Margaret said, "if we let it. Can you forgive me?" Margaret turned back. "Not today." Diane lowered her eyes. Margaret continued, not cruelly, but clearly. "Today, you can begin becoming someone who does not need to be forgiven for the same thing again." Diane nodded once. It was not the ending she wanted. It was the beginning she had earned. Richard came 3 days later. He looked older than he had during the storm. Not humbler exactly. Humility had not yet settled in him. But something had cracked enough for light to enter. He brought the Blackwater papers he had taken from the cedar chest, sealed in a cardboard file box. "I didn't destroy them," he said. Margaret accepted the box. "That is not the same as returning them before you were caught." "I know." He stood near the door, though no one had told him to stay there. "I keep hearing that line," he said. "That I was hidden because I was loved." Margaret's face softened, but only a little. "Your beginning was painful, Richard. It was not shameful." His eyes filled, and this time he did not turn the tears into anger. "I treated you like something to manage. Yes, I'm sorry. I believe you are sorry right now." He swallowed. "But that isn't enough." "No," Margaret said. "Repentance is not a speech. It is a season." He looked around the Icehouse. Earl fitting a handrail, Samuel measuring shelves, Lila labeling donated medicine under Margaret's supervision. "What can I do?" Margaret almost answered too quickly. Then she remembered every form he had turned against her. Every paper moved without permission. Every decision made in her name, but not with her voice. "You can start outside," she said. "The path needs clearing. People should not fall before they reach the door. Richard nodded. For the next month, he shoveled snow, carried lumber, and said very little. Margaret did not praise him for basic decency. She did not punish him either. She let the work speak, and the work was slow. Spring came to Blackwater Lake reluctantly. The ice thinned. The mud returned. The roof was braced. A second exit was cut. A washroom was installed with donated labor and money raised by people who once called the building useless. Evelyn helped form a small nonprofit trust, protected by the Winter Refuge Covenant, and named by Lila after something Margaret had said on the coldest night, the Thaw House. Not because the building was warm all the time. It was not. Old stone remembered winter, but because people came in frozen by more than weather. A glass case was mounted on the wall near the entrance. Inside lay the rusted tin box, Clara Wade's photograph, Thomas's letter, and the baby bracelet. Margaret insisted the display not be made dramatic. No spotlight. No polished myth. Just the truth, protected from dust. Under it, Evelyn wrote one sentence. Some lives are hidden until the world is ready to protect them. On the first official winter night after the dedication, snow began falling before dusk. Margaret sat at the long table while Noah drew pictures of the lake. Lila checked the supply shelf. Earl argued with Samuel over a crooked coat hook. Diane arrived with soup and waited at the door until Margaret invited her in. Richard cleared the path outside, breath white in the dark, then left the shovel by the steps and knocked instead of walking in. Margaret opened the door. He stood there, cold and uncertain. After a moment, she stepped aside. Not all the way back into trust, but far enough for the night. Later, when everyone had eaten, another knock came. A stranger stood outside. An elderly woman with a suitcase in one hand and a hospital discharge bracelet still around her wrist. Snow clung to her thin gray hair. "I heard," the woman said, voice shaking, "that sometimes this place lets people sit by the fire." Margaret looked past her at the dark road, then back into the room where the stove glowed red and every chair at the table could make room for one more. She opened the door wider. "Come in," Margaret said, "before the cold starts lying to you." And behind her, in the ice house nobody wanted, warmth moved toward the door like a promise finally kept.